Hey, I'm Sasha Barbigat. Welcome to this episode of The Briefing. And today I'm going to shatter something for you. It's the idea that Australia, as far away as we are, is pretty isolated from things like wars and conflicts overseas. Yes, we get dragged into them through our international alliances. But the idea of something bad happening on our shores is pretty remote. Well, today I'm going to introduce you to Pine Gap. It's a place on the outskirts of Alice Springs in the Northern Territory, and it has been referred to as one of the most important spy bases outside of the United States. People in the know think that it makes us a nuclear target. Today, I'm speaking with an ABC journalist who has been investigating Pine Gap and trying to uncover the secrets around it. So enjoy. Alex, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing today. To start us off, explain to us what is happening or what we think we know is happening at Pine Gap.
That's a huge question, Sasha. There is so much happening at Pine Gap, and having sort of deep dived into it over the past few months, you just realise how vast the reach is of this place. Pine Gap is effectively a spy base on the fringes of Alice Springs. That is sort of the eyes and ears of the world. A huge amount of surveillance is going on. Watching and listening and collecting intelligence everywhere across the Middle East, across Europe, across China, Russia. And it's run jointly between the US government and the Australian government. And it looks quite extraordinary in the landscape. You really can only see it when you fly in and out of Alice Springs. It's this huge group of sort of oversized golf ball shaped looking radomes that cover listening antenna. And it's those antenna that are part of what's the Pine Gap ground station, effectively controlling and communicating with a series of satellites that do all of that intelligence gathering across an enormous part of the globe.
Why Pine Gap? Why this spot 18 k's southwest of Alice Springs?
Yeah, look, I think whoever thought it up was a stroke of genius, because it is so hidden. It's really hidden in a valley, and it was set up there in the Cold War by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. They wanted an edge over the Soviet Union in the Cold War. They wanted to be able to listen to what was going on. They wanted to see what was going on, particularly around the Soviet Union missile development program. And this was a great spot geographically. There wasn't a lot of electronic interference. I think any Soviet spooks that were sort of around would have been spotted quite easily in a small outback town like Alice Springs. And so it was considered the perfect place. And there's a bizarre story actually about 4 men, some of them CIA officers, cracking some Australian wine over the Aranda land that was taken to build this spy base. But of course it was actually sold on a lie. It was sold as a space research facility for quite a long time. So the locals in Alice Springs were, again, no social media back then. They were just told, hey, great news, big development coming. You're going to get a space research facility. And, space was really sexy back then. So that was the sell. And then over the years, the truth has sort of slowly come out as far as, it can, because there is still so much secrecy around this place.
Yeah. So how did you start your investigation into finding out more about kind of what's happening at Pine Gap now, and tell me about what you found out in the course of your investigation?
I remember so clearly, Sasha, first moving to Alice Springs 16 years ago, not really knowing anything about Pine Gap, but there were just little moments which created real curiosity for me. A lot of American candy on the shelves, Halloween celebrated enormously. And then you would start to meet people who would say, I work at the base. So Pine Gap is often referred to as the base locally. And when you sort of said, what do you do at the base? Often they would say, I'm a gardener. And that's sort of become an in-joke in Alice Springs. It's kind of ironic given it's quite hard to garden out here in the desert. But they'd say they were a gardener, and that just meant really no more questions, thanks. I work at the base, and really that's the social norm. People just don't ask. And I think over the years, for me, that just increasingly was a curiosity, but then almost a bit of an unease. And then a local author and journalist, Kieran Finane, wrote a book called Peace Crimes, and it followed the journey and trial of a group called the Peace Pilgrims who trespassed into Pine Gap in 2016. they were really concerned that Pine Gap had a really key role in the war on terror. And that book really raised a lot of questions around, well, what does this potentially make Australia complicit in? And so from that, I really then just had an increasing interest in trying to understand what on earth is going on, in my backyard as a mum of three and a local journalist, but what is going on in the backyard of Australia? And then that is what I guess saw me then go for a bit more of a deep dive to talk to people who had worked there, who had tried to close it down, or who have championed Pine Gap over the decades.
So let's talk then about what Australia could be complicit in. Now, the argument, and rightly so, is around, the Israel-Hamas conflict in Gaza. There's anger over who is sending weapons to Israel, who is supplying these weapons that are killing civilians in such big numbers. Now, I tried to kind of find this out in a recent episode, and the question around weapons in Australia is kind of shady. We don't really know. But there are genuine fears that in Pine Gap or at Pine Gap, spying is happening that could mean Australia is complicit in the conflict in Gaza. Explain to us how.
Yeah, look, these are really serious claims. The road out to Pine Gap has now been closed twice for hours by groups of protesters who say they believe the intelligence from Pine Gap is being supplied to Israel and being used in Gaza. It's a really serious claim, and that makes Australia complicit in really serious business. Now, right now, it is almost impossible to find really concrete evidence that a piece of intelligence from Pine Gap has been given to Israel and has been used to target a Palestinian. We can't see the evidence for that. But it is worth asking really big questions around what the intelligence is being used for, because the things that we do know are that there is evidence that in 2013, the National Security Agency, which is one of the key agencies working at Pine Gap, did have an intelligence sharing arrangement with Israel. We know that for certain. And what we also know for certain, and this is from a former NSA, National Security Agency worker at Pine Gap over almost 20 years, that's David Rosenberg, he has confirmed that certainly Pine Gap is consistently surveilling the Middle East, that this war would be of significant interest to America. I mean, he very much supports what's happening at Pine Gap, and he would argue that, it is the aim of Pine Gap and the intelligence that it uses is all about minimising loss of life. But he effectively says, look, that is certainly a definite, that it is surveilling that area and would be of interest. And so all of these things together, and when you look at the fact that Pine Gap has definitely been involved in intelligence from Pine Gap has been used in previous conflicts throughout the War on Terror, in the Gulf War in 1990-91, that is why there are large numbers of Australians who are asking questions about whether or not the intelligence is being used right now and has been handed over right now. And I think what's hard in all of this is that the Australian government simply doesn't comment on Pine Gap. It hasn't historically, and it continues not to. And obviously I've been asking a lot of questions, as have others, about what intelligence gathered at Pine Gap is being used for right now. And it's just silent. So we don't know. But you have international human rights lawyers like Sharon O'Meary KC saying, if we're a mature democracy, we should be able to ask these questions and we should be able to get answers from the Australian government.
My question then is in relation to foreign attacks. If we're providing, at the moment, the conflict is relatively isolated to, the Gaza Strip, but we're also seeing Iran getting involved. We're seeing the Houthi rebels in Yemen. There is fear of a wider war in the Middle East that could spread from what, essentially began as Israel versus Hamas. If we're providing intelligence to someone's enemy, does that put us at risk of foreign attacks then, specifically Pine Gap at risk of being targeted?
It's worth taking a look at what's been the thinking on this over many decades. If you go back to the Cold War, there were so many people protesting Pine Gap specifically around the fact that they saw it as a nuclear target. Now, in the 1980s, the then Labor Foreign Defence Minister Kim Beazley, who is a big supporter of Pine Gap, he said on the record, yes, Pine Gap makes us a nuclear target. Now, he said it's worth it though. He said this place is crucial for peace and stability in the Western world. He still stands by that. He's not alone. But there were so many others saying, no, look, it puts us in the crosshairs. If we fast forward now, you talk to experts in the field, for example, Professor Richard Tanter from Melbourne University, who has spent so much of his professional life looking at Pine Gap at its increased capability, because of course it is constantly expanding. He says it continues to be a nuclear target, and he also believes because how tightly Australia is with the United States in terms of its military partnership, this is the jewel in the crown of that military alliance, and he believes that it makes Australia and Alice Springs and Buntua a nuclear target more than ever.
Wow. So do you think more people would be, we've talked, you mentioned the Pine Gap pilgrims and people who have been aware of what is happening at Pine Gap for a long time and who have protested. But I've got to say, I don't think much of it has broken through the mainstream. Do you think more people would be protesting if they knew what you just said and had a better idea of what was actually happening at Pine Gap?
It's interesting to see during the 80s, the protests were absolutely enormous. So I think Pine Gap was very much on people's, the nation's conscience. That was a big period of protest more broadly, but there were just thousands of Australians who travelled out here to protest the base. What we've seen from then till now is a sort of a roller coaster of interest. There are times when Pine Gap comes back into the national spotlight and then it does seem to disappear away. And I think a part of that is actually the fact that it is located on the fringe of this outback town. So I think it's really around just how much people engage with some of the issues that are being raised. Certainly, one of the key issues that is important in this is that now, and this relates to the peace pilgrims, now if you trespass on the base, the legislation that is used to prosecute you is really serious. It's more serious than it was back in the 80s. So it's a piece of federal legislation, the Defence Special Undertakings Act 1952. It comes with a maximum penalty of 7 years imprisonment. Now, I should say no jail time has ever been given, but it's just getting increasingly serious. So while there might be people who are, increasingly keen to protest, I think there's a real understanding of that. People have watched what has happened to protesters at Pine Gap over the years, and I suspect are probably going, well, it's getting pretty serious, and the secrecy is tighter than ever. So as to whether or not, it's hard to say, because I think that's really important to have in mind. But it certainly doesn't stop people. We still see people consistently protesting, as we have in recent months on that road out to Pine Gap with regards to the conflict in Israel-Gaza.
Given that you live in Alice Springs, you are raising your family in Alice Springs, how safe do you feel living in that town, given everything that you found out about what's happening at Pine Gap?
Sasha, so many people that I spoke to for the podcast Spies in the Outback said to me they actually wouldn't live in Alice Springs. And I sort of found that quite shocking, and I think I found it shocking because I love this town and I've loved living here and raising my family here over the last 16 years and reporting on all the extraordinary things that happen in Alice Springs. Certainly going deep for Spies in the Outback has made me really grapple with what it is that we're living right next door to. Certainly made me grapple with what Australia is involved in. And you can't help but then think, okay, what does this mean for bringing up my kids right next to a place that is, quite likely a nuclear target? So it is something you think really seriously about. But, I love this town and I love being a journalist here, so that's not going to change.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that there is reportedly a prime nuclear target, as you said, in our very own backyards. Alex Barwick, thank you so much for talking to us today and for sharing what you've learned as you've investigated Pine Gap.
Great to talk to you, Sasha.
Well, that is it for this episode. Thanks so much for watching. If you haven't yet, please like and subscribe and keep up to date with everything we do here at The Briefing. But also leave a comment below and let us know what you thought of this chat. I'm Sasha Barwick. Catch you next time.